So there you go, we're recording now. Right, welcome everybody to this Labour for European Future webinar. So today we're talking about Labour, Brexit and the regions. So looking at Brexit's impact on the regions of the UK and also looking at how public opinion is changing and at local coverage as well of how Brexit is working out in different parts of the country. So I'm very pleased to be joined by a great group of people. So we've got Alex Mayer, former MEP for the East of England, David Taylor-Gooby, who is an activist and has got a long backstory in the Labour Party, Jackie Jones, former MEP for Wales, and Joyce Quin, who is both a former MEP and a former MP. We were going to be joined by Ben Jeckford, who used to work for us actually, and is also in the Northeast, but he's unable to join us. His child's unwell, unfortunately, but I'm sure we'll have him at another webinar another time. So without further ado, Joyce, I'll come across to you first, if that's okay. So it'd be great to hear from you about your views on Brexit in the Northeast, and then also your view from the House of Lords, where you're currently a sitting member.
Thanks very much, Mike, and it's good to see some familiar names on the list. So good to be in touch with you. I think I'll start by referring to the survey that was done by the North East Chamber of Commerce very recently, a survey of their members of their experience in exporting to the EU after Brexit. And it's probably worth saying that, the North East had, I think as a region, the largest dependence on the European market of any region across the UK, approaching 60%. And also the North East was rather proud of the fact that it did have a positive trade balance. This was obviously before Brexit. The surveys that the North East Chamber of Commerce carried out showed that, and I'll just quote a few of the figures to you very briefly, that 75% of companies surveyed had a negative or very negative experience of Brexit so far. 37% had seen their UK-EU trade fall. 53% had experienced difficulties with new customs processes. 66% had experienced delays at port or a shortage of hauliers, and that shortage of hauliers seems to be quite a crisis situation at the present time. And 32% found that their goods did not meet new rules of origin and therefore could not benefit from tariff-free trade. 38% had experienced unexpected or unquoted costs while trading with the EU. And so overall, it was an alarming situation. And this survey was actually very recent, just at the end of last month. And therefore, I don't think can be explained by teething problems. I saw a newspaper headline which said that teething problems are becoming permanent pain. And I think that is true in terms of quite a large number of companies. There's also something which is become quite marked, that so many companies, in order to deal with these problems, have set up distribution hubs in the EU itself. But of course, this means that jobs are being created in the EU and actually are being lost here at home. In terms of some industries that I've come across personally in the Northeast, I've had quite a lot of contact with the manager of a specialist brewery who has a quality product, and they built up their EU trade over many years. Now, because of COVID, their trade, I think, decreased at first by half, but of the trade that they have left, half of that was put in jeopardy through Brexit. And although they're trying to build it up again, they feel that the difficulties they had in the early part of this year have caused their customers to turn elsewhere within the EU. And so they have lost trade permanently as a result. The other local business that I've had particular contact with was the fishing port of North Shields, which is England's premier prawn exporting port. And 90% of that went to the EU. They've had tremendous difficulty since Brexit in exporting, particularly on the fresh side of a product that only has a sort of a 5-day fresh shelf life. Before Brexit, took 1 day to get to France, and after Brexit took 3 days, including a journey from here up to Glasgow and then back to the south coast, where it was part of a bigger consignment. And if any one part of that consignment had failed to fill in the forms correctly, then the whole of the consignment got held up. So the overall experience that they had was anything but the frictionless trade that we heard so much about at one time. And of course, the no new non-tariff barriers, which was Boris Johnson's claim on Christmas Eve when this deal was concluded, which he obviously didn't understand himself. Finally, let me say one or two things about the House of Lords. Obviously, we have in the House of Lords Lord Frost, who is the Brexit negotiator, and he has a regular question time in the House of Lords where we do raise some of these issues with him. He is saying now that trade is back to the level it was in 2019, which does seem extremely odd given all the problems that I've outlined. We do keep raising issues with him, particularly the transfer of jobs that's taken place to the EU. But in taking part in this event, I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people have to say, so that we have more ammunition and more issues that we can raise with him and with other ministers in the House of Lords as we try desperately to make a success of what's happening, even though we all know it's a very bad deal and nothing like the wonderful deal that we had as part of the single market and the customs union.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Joyce, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Alex, I'll come straight across to you, please, if that's okay.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks ever so much, Mike, and thank you for arranging this meeting. Look, I want to start by saying that obviously Brexit is making our country weaker, poorer and more isolated. And personally, I would like us to join the European Union again one day, but I really don't think that's going to be for some time. And I know this is sometimes unpopular with pro-European audiences that I speak to, but I don't think it's going to happen if we as pro-Europeans dwell on the past, if we say that the referendum was unfair, if we cheer British failures, if we wave EU flags, not our own. And even though these issues are really important, it also can't be a debate about EU citizens living in the UK and our British citizens who live in the EU. I think we're only going to be able to join the European Union again when trade unions and businesses are making a pragmatic, patriotic case. So it's going to be born of economic necessity and also our belief in a social Europe, but also when we as a nation are once again kind of confident in our place in the world and at ease with ourselves. Now, I absolutely agree that Brexit is harming our nation, and leaving the world's largest single market, coupled with a global pandemic, a climate crisis and an extreme Tory government, is making that absolutely even worse. And not only is it a challenging time for the UK as a whole, I think it's a special challenge for regions. European funding that came to our country, it was regional. I mean, it was an alphabet spaghetti of different acronyms, but things like ESF funding, ERDF funding. There was never any battle to prize funding away from London. We were always guaranteed our fair share. And that's also the same for those people who live in rural and semi-rural communities. Again, we got our entitlements. It wasn't a question that cities always won out. And I think also not often discussed is that Europe is a place of regions and the European Union is a place of regions. When I was an MEP, I'd often meet European regional political leaders. So if you wanted to invest in Flanders, say, it was absolutely clear who you'd pick up the phone to. In East Anglia, it was a completely open and unanswered question as to who you spoke to if you wanted to invest in our area. Now, the government, it seems to me, has rolled up all of these challenges, as well as adding in a healthy dose of Tory partisanship, and come up with their response, which is the oft repeated but rarely explained concept of levelling up. And I think we should give credit where credit's due. It's a really good soundbite. And just as an aside, frankly, I think we in the Labour and trade union movement need to get better at soundbites, get better at language. You know, take back control, get Brexit done, Ramonas. They've definitely had the best of it over the last few years. But it does seem to me that levelling up is for Labour and for our regions, in part a vacuous Tory slogan, but also in part dangerous. I don't think that Boris Johnson has got any real ideas apart from his slogan. And I think we saw that in last week's widely trailed speech, where he was literally asking for answers as to what he should do next on a postcard. Is it going to be about more decentralisation and devolution? I mean, frankly, I think it's mainly about making sure that the Tories win the next election, and it's for his new ex-Red Wall Tory MPs. And I think also in his speech last week, while there was nothing on the table for the largely Labour metro mayors, he did raise the concept of more county mayors. And of course, if you look at the geography and politics of that, there are 24 county councils across the UK, and only 3 of them are not Tory run. The Tory politics of the shires is still very strong. So what do I think that Labour should do? Well, I do believe that out of great crisis does come opportunity, and we're clearly in a moment of crisis and change. I think we've had a pandemic which has taught us who the real key workers are: the nurses, the supermarket staff, teachers, lorry drivers, sewage workers. Turned out, you know, when push came to shove, there was no need for special rules for hedge funds managers. And clearly, you know, the government's 1% pay offer to the NHS staff is derisory, and we as a Labour Party should be campaigning on that. But I think actually what it's shown us even more is that people out there share our Labour values, because I think the pandemic did teach us all about solidarity and community. And I think we need to embrace that energy. The energy of things like mutual aid groups. And I think we do need to be the party of local communities and the party of regions. So I think a Labour response does need to think about building regional identities. One other thing about Brexit is we lost all our MEPs, and I know there's plenty of people on the call unhappy about that. But we were one of those few groups of people who were regional politicians who went on those regional TV channels and talks about the case for our regions, not, you know, an MP who's just concerned about their own fairly small constituency, but looking at things in a wider way. So I think a Labour response does also need to be about building regional identity, and I would say especially in the Midlands and the South as well. If you're Welsh, as Jackie knows, you know full well that you're Welsh. You know, if you live in Scotland, you know you're Scottish. I can tell you, if you live in Bedfordshire or Essex or places like Gloucestershire, it really is less clear. And I also think we need to bury the dangerous narrative that levelling up, or whatever Labour's plan is going to be to share prosperity, is about North versus South, because we can't get drawn into that. I think that's part of the kind of phony culture wars that the Tories are trying to stoke. And it's a divide and rule strategy. And just as Joe Biden in the States skillfully plotted a course through that minefield and won, we need to win too. Which does bring me to winning, because I do think winning is very important. I do think it's important we get behind Keir Starmer and start winning. It does seem to me to be getting more and more urgent. I mean, at the time of the next general election, it's now likely to be 14 years of Conservative rule. And if we mess that one up, it'll be 19 years. That is an entire generation passing since the last Labour government, potentially. But finally, I like to end on a note of optimism rather than pessimism. I'm a socialist, after all, you have to be optimistic. I do think it's worth looking at the 2 regional mayoralties that we did win off the Tories in May, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Dr. Nick Johnson, in an area that I used to represent, in an area that frankly, I know it's got Cambridge in it, but it's got a lot of other in it as well. And it's an area that frankly, nobody thought that Labour was likely to win a regional mayor in. And the west of England, where I happen to be at the moment, where I was the campaign manager for Dan Norris, who got elected with a whacking great majority of 40,000. He represents Jacob Rees-Mogg now, so there's hope for us all. And I think the reason that we won those campaigns is that they were genuinely regionally linked, and that was at the heart of it. Local communities and local regions were at the heart of those campaigns. They were positive campaigns. We talked about normal stuff. We were proud of our communities and sincere about it. And I think that neatly brings me back to Brexit again, because I never ever want to run another campaign which is about Project Fear, another good Tory vote leave slogan, because I don't think we win on fear. I think Labour wins on the politics of hope, and I think that is what we need to focus all our efforts on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex. Sorry, I was checking I'm not on mute. I'm assuming not. In which case, Benj isn't here, unfortunately, so as I say, so we will come straight across to you, David.
Me? Oh, can you all hear me? Right.
Yes.
Well, I'm afraid I'm not as eminent as some of the other speakers. I was very active in the referendum campaign. Before that, I've been a councillor, and I also involved with the NHS. And I currently am a lay member of a North East Combined Authority. And that gives me a bit of insight into what happens with these European grants, or what has happened with these European grants, for the point. I think following on from what Alex said, which was extremely eloquent, and I totally agree with it, about regions. It's obvious, and I think as Joyce has mentioned too, the Brexit has not benefited the North East. But I think we want to, forgive my accent, but I actually live in the North East. I live in Peterlee, which is a new town. Now, these successes that we've recently had in the North East, such as predominantly Nissan, were largely the results of initiatives that had taken place before Boris did any deals. The Advanced Manufacturing Park was a big investment by the North East Combined Authority using partly European funds. This was all set up before Boris did any deals with Nissan. And I think we can claim quite a lot of credit for getting Nissan to stay here and getting the battery manufacturer here in the North East from North East people themselves. I think just in case you don't understand how combined authorities work, they're European, and that money came to the North East on set criteria of lack of skills, lack of high unemployment, and so on. And therefore, I think, as Alex said, you got it anyway. And then it was under the control of local people. The local enterprise partnership was accountable to the combined authority. Just to repeat, that's not a directly elected body. It is representatives of local authorities. And then they decided things like the Advanced Manufacturing Park, which helped Nissan very much. So it was all decided locally and with funds that we knew we would get. So now what's the situation? Well, we haven't really heard what the levelling up funds are going to do. There are funds for doing uptown centres and a few things like that. Bishop Auckland, surprise, surprise, has got some money. Bishop Auckland's already very privileged. A philanthropist gave them a lot of money and they built new museums and things, lovely, all this stuff. But I could have think of other areas that would have been better candidates for the money. Trouble is, Bishop Auckland has a Tory MP, and it's a seat they want to hang on to. So that's an example of what's happening. And then local authorities are being asked to bid for funding from the national government. The whole point of this is that no longer do you get guaranteed money coming to you, you have to bid for what the government will give you. And we all know what is happening, political patronage. But another rather insidious effect of it that I've noticed is that everybody going for training to build up our workforce or to develop high-tech industries, it tends to want to go for prestige projects. And I did a bit of sniffing about this lately. There was a wonderful prestige project in Hartlepool back in the 1980s, the marina. All the old docks were converted. It's lovely. Lots of rich people have yachts there now. Has that contributed very much to dealing with unemployment, lack of skills, the new industry in Hartlepool? Well, I don't think so. Has made the town rather nice. It's something that tourists like to go and see. But these capital projects aren't necessarily the answer. What we've got to do is improve the training of the workforce and develop new industries in these regions. As to whether people are now feeling a greater sense of Northeast identity, one of the problems when regional devolution was mooted back in the time of Tony Blair and John Prescott, if you remember, there wasn't a Northeast regional identity. People thought they would lose their counties. They would be subsumed into some directly elected body. So that's why the present arrangement are the counties stay and the combined authority as a sort of delegate body from that. Whether that's the model we continue to go for, I'm not sure. But what I do think is that funding has to come to a Northeast to be accountable to people in the Northeast and other regions of the country on a guaranteed basis. And the people in that region then decide how it's spent. Not this idea you go and beg for it from London. That's a big change that is coming about as a result of Brexit. So I think perhaps I'll stop there, and if people want to have any questions, they will. And on the atmosphere, I think Joyce mentioned it very eloquently. The atmosphere is changing. I've still got scars on my back from the old regional campaign in 2001, I think. I think now the atmosphere is changing. Certainly the leading newspapers in the Northeast, like the Northern Echo and the Journal, are now advocating some sort of regional body. I had a correspondence with the editor of the Journal today, and he said exactly that we need something that we decide how the money is spent. We don't go with a cap in hand to London. So if we can sort of somehow get this message over, Labour can get this message over, it's as a result of Brexit, these things have happened, and we need to have a much stronger devolved administration if we're going to do anything about it. So there you are.
Great, thank you, David. And then last but absolutely not least, Jackie Jones.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here tonight, Bore da, from Wales, as you can see, sunny as ever. I'd like to talk about three different things, and it's a much more broader outlook, I hope, so a different perspective to the fantastic speakers we've had so far tonight. And that is about the Welsh Government response to Brexit, because as you know, Wales voted out. Some parts of Wales didn't, but quite a few parts did, and overall it voted out. I think near enough every survey that was done since then has said basically people have changed their minds somewhat, but the fact is we're out, and we're out for a while, I would imagine. So where does the Welsh Government position itself? Well, once the 2019 election was over, it very much was in favour of closely aligning to the European Union, to the regulatory regime and everything else, and it has that position to date. In January 2021, our First Minister sent a letter to Ursula von der Leyen setting out the policy direction for the Welsh Government, and I don't see it having changed since the elections, and where Welsh Labour again was returned for the 22nd year in a row to government, and with 30 representatives, so being able to govern by itself with the help of one individual. So the direction is one of close alignment to the EU policies, regulations and stuff, that's a technical term, but realizing that we live in an international environment where the EU will change and the UK will change. So trying to come together with those, reconciling those two positions. And what it also set out is that it wants to trade more Wales in the international arena. So with Ireland, with Brittany, with the Basque Country, with Flanders. So areas, regions that it recognizes maybe has some alignment with language and culture going back. So I would say that that would be the internationalization. So the first prong of the approach, internationalization. Now, internationalization also has been muted just this, well, on the 19th of July. Is that today? That's today. With a focus on trade to Ireland. So making closer links, trade links with Ireland. And there's a pilot scheme going ahead with 10 companies exporting their wares, different kinds of products as well as services to Ireland. And it's obviously a natural thing to do because we're right close next door to Ireland and have a lot of links there, constitutional links as well as institutional links. And I say constitutional links because there are various aspects of constitutional law that do go over to Ireland from Wales and from the UK indeed. So the Economic Action Plan then mentions Ireland in particular, and it focuses on that. When it comes to the TCA, the Welsh Government has recognised, obviously we have to go along with that. There's no getting out of it, but it has challenged it. And that is the second pronged approach that I want to talk about, and that is devolution redesign. So the Internal Market Act, you will know that the Welsh Government has a court case against the UK government about it, that it breaches certain articles of our, what I would call the Constitution, or the settlement, the constitutional settlement. And whereas originally it was not allowed in the High Court, the appeal has been granted in the Court of Appeal, and we await a court case for that. So watch this space. And the reason that I mention that is because of various closely alignments of the Welsh Government and other aspects, of course, I think the devolution settlement is up for grabs and is teetering on the verge of something. And of course, it's not just Wales, it's about the whole of the United Kingdom. So the Council General has announced a constitutional commission, which is a UK-wide as well as Welsh-centred commission looking at the devolution process. And that's come about because there's quite a lot of people who are talking about independence right now. And I wouldn't dismiss that for one moment at all. It was writ large in the elections just passed, and it's still here, and every day it's growing, the movement is growing. Whether in fact people want independence itself, because that doesn't pan out from the elections in May, but certainly it's on the agenda and it has to be taken seriously. The third aspect of that is free ports. And as you will know, England has, I think it was 8 free ports assigned to it, or has been given the go-ahead, whereas in Wales, none have been. And one of the reasons the Welsh Government didn't support the free ports initiative is because they were offered a lot less money than in any free port in England. And the Welsh Government said, under those circumstances, you're setting it up to fail. So we're a bit at loggerheads about free ports, which could go ahead in Holyhead or Milford Haven. 2 possibilities, but watch this space. So there are quite a lot of fights going on with this devolution redesign, I would say, and power grab that's going on. And finally, I would say the third pronged approach is mitigation, mitigating the harshness of some of the effects of coming out of the EU. So for example, EU citizens being able to get settled status and providing financial support and other support in order for them to be able to do that. Closely localizing collaboration, where possible with the EU. Having another member of staff in the Wales House, so expanding the number of people who are dealing with EU issues in Brussels, and also ensuring that as much money as possible is given over to mitigating the harshness of the economic harshness of coming out of the European Union. So fishing, farming, very, very challenging indeed about that. So there's great shortages in NHS. We've got a privatisation bill right now before Parliament in Westminster. NHS is devolved, of course, the provision of healthcare is devolved. So trying to mitigate what is happening in England at the moment, that's going to be a big one. And seasonal workers, very difficult to get, very challenging to get seasonal workers as well. And finally, I just want to mention the International Learning Exchange Programme, which is the Welsh Government's response to the UK government's coming out of Erasmus Plus programme. So that's going ahead with the support of about 65 million. It's going to be set up in 2022, going forward to 2027 to try and mitigate some of those things. That's for youth, so school children, apprenticeships, and university and staff student exchanges, very similar to Erasmus Plus. Can't do it all, of course, because it's too much money, and we are not allowed to be in Erasmus Plus as well. So those are some of the things that the Welsh Government is trying to do. I'm not saying at all that it's fantastic. It's just trying to do the best in very challenging circumstances, especially after COVID. So thanks, Mike.
Great, thank you so much, Jackie. Right, so we'll move on. We've got some time for Q&A now. So if anyone has questions, you can raise your hand using the reactions tab, or you can write your question in the chat. So first question from me though, and this can go to all of you or any of you. I'm just wondering if how aware you are of how regional and local media are reporting Brexit in the parts of the country where you are. So I'll come straight back to you, Jackie, if that's all right. What's Welsh media doing and saying on Brexit and the impacts of Brexit for Wales, or is there very little being said? Obviously, in part in light of the pandemic.
I wouldn't say there is that much. I think what keeps it more alive is the Welsh ministers who stand up in the Senedd, who say across the chamber what a terrible deal this is, and that we're closely aligning, and they keep repeating that message because that's Welsh Government policy. In the media, it's just problematic, isn't it, Mike, in general? And where do you go with that anyway? There doesn't seem to be very much room in order to be very, very pro-European at the moment. Or if in the newspapers. There are like Martin Shipton, who's Wales Online, he's the main reporter, political reporter, is quite pro-European. There's Clyde, it's very pro-European. But again, it's a very small media we have in Wales anyway, it's mostly national. We have The National now, which is a national newspaper, just started. So it's challenging.
Sure. What about you guys, Alex, David, Joyce, media in your areas? Is there more being said on Brexit or very little?
I can say something on that. I have quite close ties for the Newcastle Journal, which is perhaps the most influential Northeast paper, which sort of regards itself as champion of the Northeast. Well, I do a column for them, actually. I've just sent one in. I don't bang on all the time about Brexit, but I tend to try and allude to it as an aside, because you get endangered if you go on about it all the time. People don't read the column, they just think, oh, we know what he's going to say, and switch off. But the editor, and I had a chat with him today, is very anti-Brexit, but he has to think, and quite a lot of editorial content is, you know, sort of keeps asking questions about why we've got, and they have quite a central business section, which I read, and a lot of people in that are worried about the problems Joyce alluded to, you know, about difficult getting things in. The other big paper is the Northern Echo, which deals more with Teesside and Yorkshire, which of course is a North Yorkshire, Rishi Sunak area, is a bit more of a Tory area. they give Ben Houshan quite a lot of airspace. Ben Houshan hardly ever mentions Brexit. He just goes on about how good he is and about the stuff he's getting for Teesside. But because he's a very skilled PR operator, he gets quite a lot of space. Nobody really answers him in the south on Teesside, around there. I think perhaps one of the reasons is just lack of Labour representation to stick up for it. So if you want, my question is, the television media, we have quite good balanced debate, but just not much airtime. You know, you get half an hour every week. And yeah, we get some representation about Brexit. So I wouldn't say it's totally negative. And in fact, there are quite positive sources. You don't hear much from Sunderland now, which was supposed to be so anti-Europe. Sunderland has calmed down a bit. There you are. I hope that's some help.
That's great, yeah. And Joyce, obviously you're in a very similar part of the country to David. What have you seen in local media, regional media?
My apologies, by the way, I missed quite a bit of the discussion, partly because I had connectivity problems and partly because of a phone call which I had to take. But you know, I think I basically agree with what I've heard David say. There's a, you know, because of all the sort of fixation about the red wall, there is a bit of an impression that, you know, the Northeast is now a Tory region. Well, I think we have to remember that there are more than twice as many Labour MPs in the region as there are Tory MPs, and that it's very easy. The media like to overstate these issues, but I mean, I think particularly as the penny drops as to the nature of the Tory government of Boris and his, I was going to say cronies, his team, you know, I perhaps like early speakers, I don't want to be pessimistic. I think there is a lot we can do to win back support. On Brexit itself, I mean, different issues get an airing. The difficulties of the fishing industry and exporting to Europe were quite publicised at the beginning of the year. But I mean, I think there is a feeling that, you know, the people just wish the whole issue would go away. And David is quite right. You've got to almost manage what you say about Brexit. I do think, however, and this is my last point, that I think there is a patriotic case to make for close relationships with Europe, and that Labour does need to do that. It's not just the common sense of trading with your biggest market and your nearest neighbours, and the fact that that makes environmental sense as well as economic sense. I mean, I think that, you know, when you do mention Brexit, it's because of problems that are being created here as a result of what the government did in its deal. And so there is you can square the circle. You don't have to sound jingoistic like the Tories. You can be patriotic and in an enlightened way, which does mean a very close relationship with the EU because it makes sense on so many levels.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, we'll come to some questions from others.
Alex,
So we've got.
Did you want me to respond to that?
Sorry,
one?
Alex. Sorry, Alex. Yes,
no, don't worry.
In fact, I only missed you because I thought in my brain I'd already asked you, but I haven't. So I was expecting that you were going to tell us about the east of England, then also the west, because of course that's where you've been with Dan.
Yes, east and west. I would say there's not massive amount of coverage, but I also think if you think back to the pre-Brexit era, i.e. when we were just happily in the European Union, there really wasn't any discussion about being in the European Union then. We just got blanket coverage from the referendum moment onwards. So I actually think we're back to that situation, i.e. it's the status quo, and therefore people aren't as bothered about it. That being said, I do think that there are stories about Europe Europe and Brexit in the media, but they get in not because they're about Brexit, but because they're about local people and local issues. You can place stories in there as well. I'm thinking of a wine importer who's a Labour Party member who gets fantastic publicity across the east of England for the ridiculous situation he's got with all these extra forms and paperwork he's got to fill in at the borders. He keeps on going on about red tape, and he had 20,000 bottles of red wine stuck that he couldn't get over from France. Those kind of stories definitely get you in. Places like Felixstowe, the docks, you get stories about that linking into the shortages of drivers. Both of the east and west are largely rural regions as well. The situation about not having the right number of people to pick our crops because those people are not coming over from Eastern Europe, who were actually pretty skilled workers. That is making the news at the moment. And I'd also say that, frankly, they aren't a group of people who bang on about it, who have got magic letters after their name. The other thing that MEPs used to be able to do was talk about Europe. I used to make it my business to make sure I was in 3 regional newspapers every week doing something pro-European. They print you if you've got a title. And I think Labour MPs are basically scared of it at the moment. I don't think we've got many councillors who want to talk about it. So I think I'm going to have to pass the baton back to the House of Lords. We need lots of Lords talking about the problems, but also the opportunities if we were to form a closer relationship with our nearest neighbours and partners again.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, sorry for missing you before. That was definitely a mistake. Right, Peter, I'll come across to you, please. You've got your hand raised.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Oh dear. Excuse me. I think I agree with much of what has been said, but I don't think it goes anywhere far enough. So I'll try to be brief. I agree that we don't try to set up a north versus south. I think that's counterproductive. But London, as the default, is always that London gets so much more on almost everything. I live in London, but I'm from the north, and I see this, and it's causing enormous political resentment across many regions outside London. Most people don't live in London. I say that regularly. And if I'm speaking down here, I tag on it because of the London voices that London is a great city. I always pacify them with that. It is, it's true. But why should it have 15 times more transport spending? So my proposal is, for example, that we should have a thing called the Council of the North. The problem with the mayoralties and others is, as David said, you get to bid for it. In other words, they'll play one off against another, and they'll do it constantly. And it's a game they love. That's what they know how to do. That's deep in their Tory culture. Public school boys do that. That's what, if you ever met any, that's what they do almost instantly when they meet you. So if we had a Council of the North, and you could have something of the Southwest, the Midlands, let them decide it, that they would either have an overall democratic regional authority, I know that's a big issue, or a strategic planning authority. Unless we have something like that, we would be outbid and played against, and they would then play the Northeast against the Northwest, Lancashire against Yorkshire. They could stir all those things up. So I think a Council of the North with real strategic powers would actually have some real balancing impact upon the spending and the decisions. So you would not have, for example, HS2, a catastrophic strategic plaything, which is only going to suck people into London. I'm not even certain it will reach Manchester because the money will run out. It's completely out of control. Everything I read on it is catastrophic spending, failures of spending control. So I'm afraid that that's going to happen. It's going to deepen the resentments, and it's going to have serious political impacts unless we address this. So do others agree is my question.
Great, thank you. Who'd like to take that? David, you were
Well, I can just answer it very quickly. I mean, I was very agnostic about elected mayors, but we are where we are. There is already a regional transport body. Perhaps not many people have heard of it, but it does include Liverpool, Manchester, and right up to the northeast. That bids for money. and doesn't get very much, basically, at the moment. Money at the moment is, I think, being allocated mainly to improving the line between Manchester and Leeds. So regional mayors, there is a lot of money, because I'm also on, there is a regional transport committee of all the local authorities in the North East, and I'm chair of scrutiny for that. That is already missing out on quite a lot of money that could come to the North East if we had an elected mayor. It's going to mayoral authorities. Now, at the moment, you have a mayor of North of Tyne with very limited powers, and no mayor for the rest of the Northeast region, and of course Teesside's separate. So reluctantly, I think we're going to have mayors for regions. By that I mean like the Northeast, on the line of the Manchester one, if we're going to get funding under the present regime. There's also an idea too, and I can float this around to colleagues, is one of the problems right back in 2000 odd, when they had a referendum on a Northeast Assembly, was that there wasn't much identity for the Northeast. People didn't really feel it. People felt loyalty to Durham or Newcastle or wherever. If you have an elected mayor, you do have somebody who speaks for the whole region. The problem at the moment is with a combined authority is those people all represent their own authority. They'll combine, but they don't sort of represent the region somehow. It's just a feeling I've got. So there you are. I think we're going to have to reluctantly accept elected mayors. Otherwise, we're going to miss out on funding.
Can I come in there, Mike, as well?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, and I partly agree with David and partly disagree in that I think that the referendum in 2004, I mean, it was a very disappointing result, and there were all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, partly there was a bit of a de facto unholy alliance between those who didn't want it and thought it was some European plot to divide us into regions, and those who did want it but felt we were being sold a pup in comparison with the powers of Scotland, Wales and London, in fact. But I don't agree with David that there wasn't a sense of regional identity. I think it is strong, and it's something that I feel very strongly myself. I very much identify with the Northeast, rather than, although I'm probably a Northumbrian, I've also lived in Tyne and Wear and Durham. I think of myself as a Northeasterner rather than as a county person. And I think there is that identity. Where I do agree with David is that I think de facto, if you had a mayor for a combined authority that as was being put forward, and is still a possibility, I think, for Northumberland, Tyne and Wear and Durham. It's a shame that Teesside's doing its own thing with Ben, what's his name, but I think if you had that Northumberland, Tyne and Wear and Durham, you would have actually quite an effective regional structure that worked very well when we had a regional development agency, which worked very well when we had regional departmental offices. I'm less attracted to the Council of the North idea simply on the grounds of numbers. I mean, the Northeast alone has a bigger population than Northern Ireland, and about the same as Wales. And I just feel that if you have too big a conglomeration, that it becomes unwieldy, and you then start getting some of the centralised problems that we're all too familiar with in terms of Westminster and London. And therefore, I think that there'd be nothing to stop the northern authorities, regional authorities or elected mayors working together. And in fact, we've seen that a little bit over COVID, which is encouraging. So I think you could get cooperation across the north, and that would perhaps be better than a pan-northern body, which I think could be unwieldy.
Great, thank you. Alex?
Can I just bang the drum again for the non-London South, of which there is a lot. And a lot of those people who have issues identifying where they're from do definitely all identify with the fact that they're not from London, even right on the fringes of London, right near the M25. There are bits I used to represent who definitely thought they did not come from London, and that was all that kind of hung them together. I do think in the South there is an issue with regional identity. I've come to the conclusion that people basically identify with their BBC TV region because that's the only way that they find out about what's going on in places reasonably nearby. Regional development agencies used to actually do some work on building regional identities, and I think if we as a Labour Party are serious about regional devolution, that is something we ought to think about. In terms of a council of the North, I don't know, I think I prefer a council of the regions. Gordon Brown's obviously doing all his work at the moment for his constitutional convention, so people should probably feed into that. There are clearly more powers becoming available through devolution into combined authorities, into directly elected mayors. Particularly on transport. So the options now of enhanced partnerships or franchising for buses. I think there's some opportunities coming out of the Williams Shap train review. I think fundamentally you could end up with train franchising as well out of that. But I do think as a Labour Party, we need to look at the structures. There are some inherent problems with them as well. You're ending up with a collection of district councils or of unitary authorities who are in the main not that happy that they've given away some of their power. You can then end up with a directly elected mayor on top of that, who may well be of a different political persuasion, particularly in the south of the country, and who frankly don't have that many powers that are given to them directly. For example, many mayors don't even get to vote on their own budget because of the way that combined authorities are set up. So I think we do need to look at some of the rules around that as well.
Great, thank you. Jackie.
It's a whole different debate in Wales, isn't it? But I know that we've got one more question, so I'll leave it at that. Just to say one thing, North and South Wales are very different.
Mm.
Yes, having been to both, that's very true. Right, Neil, well, thank you, Jackie and Alex. Right, Neil, we'll come across to you, please.
Thank you. First of all, how much do you think, I'm addressing this to most of the panel, say Alex, for example, she's the one who raised the R word, my favourite word on the EU debate, rejoin. How much do you think the pandemic, when it does eventually go away, which by the way is nowhere near as soon as the Tories have you believe, but once it has gone, unless civilization collapses and we all die from some mutant strain, how long after that do you think the excuse that it's teething troubles will be able to fly with people about the shortcomings of Brexit? And what is the tipping point at which so many people say, enough of this, let's get back in. At least we knew where we stood. I got this, this, and this. And how does Labour handle that pivot? Once it does get to a critical mass of people say, we want to rejoin, at what point does Labour start turning around and saying, well, we better start campaigning for rejoining rather than close alignment? And to Jackie, Andy, to all of you, this is about regions. I've been on this now 4 or 5 times and not once has the S word been used. Scotland. We all, let's be honest, what does Scotland want? They want to rejoin. The price of the union remaining is rejoining the EU. Do you credibly foresee a future of a united UK outside of the EU, or a united UK or a divided UK outside the EU? Do you really think there's a credible possibility, unless of course EU rejects Scotland joining, of course, do you really credibly see a possibility that Britain can stay together if we're outside the EU, particularly where Scotland is concerned? And Jackie, one more thing on the regional thing. How do we find a way to preserve and respect the fact that there are people like me who don't see themselves as Welsh? I only see myself as British and European. How do we fold people like me into the fold? Because I know you said yourself, you know who you are, you're Welsh, you're Welsh. And every time I hear somebody say that, I get offended when I'm called Welsh, because I don't. I'm part of this wonderful community called Britain. which is part of an even bigger community called Europe, which is part of an even bigger community called the planet Earth and the human race. How then do we respect that there are people like me, and not just jingoistic bigots, I should stress? So that's my question. Sorry for the incoherence.
No, that's fine.
No, that's
do you want
great.
me to answer that, Mike? Yeah.
Yes, I did just want to mention it looks like I'd forgotten Scotland when I put this event together. I didn't actually. I did ask some people from Scotland to come and speak, and none of them could make it. But you're quite right. Scotland is an essential part of this, and I'm sorry that there's nobody here to represent them this evening. But yes, Jackie, please go ahead.
Just to clarify, I think Alex called me Welsh.
Oh,
it wasn't me.
Sorry.
I self-identified, but I'm proudly Welsh, but European, and I'm half German as well. So I'm very European, and I lived in America. Anyway, that's beside the point. But what I've said in the past and what I say tonight as well is that about rejoining or joining European Union, whatever it might look like in the future. I think we have to ask people. And that's part of what I would see as the Constitutional Convention or Commission or whatever it ends up being called, because we have to bring people along with us. And we know what happened when we didn't. And I remember doing a master's in 1992. The first page says there's not enough positive information about the European Union. At the time, it wasn't called that. So, this is an ongoing debate, ongoing thing that is lacking in our political circles, if you like, in the UK. I just think we're different now. It has to be different, and Labour Party can't do any navel gazing. We don't have time for that. The whole thing is being eroded. All of the welfare systems, the safety nets, etc. They're all going one by one because there's an 80-seat majority. And we have to be really careful about it. Firefighting continually, whether it's Northern Ireland, Scotland, obviously it's the SNP up there, but or in Wales, and indeed the Metro Mayors, etc. Firefighting constantly on purpose because of the politics of division. So I think you have to bring people along, and you have to ask them what they actually want, and you have to be thematic about it. This is just my thoughts, and you can't just impose it on them because it doesn't work. And then you have to have some really spend a lot of money on advertising, as in the message. It's much more crucial than anything else now. I hardly read newspapers. That's why I was a bit, what do I say about this? Because it's all about social media. So I think a fundamental shift to the 21st century. Thank you very much. We need.
Great, thank you. Right, I'll come to the other three of you, and then we'll need to finish up. So, answer to Neil's question, and then any final comments as well. So, Joyce, did you want to go next? And I wondered, Joyce, whether you had any thoughts on Scotland, because you don't live too far from the Scottish border.
Yes, you're right. My first thought is I'd absolutely hate to have an international border just up the road with some of the problems that we've already got now in Northern Ireland, and the border with the Republic and the border with Great Britain. I mean, I do have a lot of sympathy with what was said a few minutes ago, and that, I feel British rather than English, and maybe because a lot of my ancestors were borderers, but I also have, as well as Scottish ancestry, Irish too. And, I like the idea of Britishness within Europe, of course. And so, but I think that there's a lot of water to flow under a lot of bridges before we really get to a point where Scotland leaves the UK. I think it is a danger, and obviously the idea of Indie Ref 2 is very much around. But having campaigned for Better Together during the Scottish referendum, I was struck with how noisy the nationalist voices were compared to the quiet reaction you got from knocking on doors, where you actually found that there was a much greater attachment to being together, and the fact that people had connections all over Britain. Gordon Brown came up with a statistic. I don't know where on earth he got it from, but it was at the time of the Act of Union in 1707, only something like 1% of people in Scotland had relatives in other parts of the UK, and now that figure is 50%. Now, I'm wary, I can't imagine an opinion poll was done in 1707, and I don't quite know what statistics gathering was like in 1707, but it did strike me as a very good example of the common bonds. And since we're becoming within all our parts of the UK much more diverse, it just seems at the end of the day retreating into nationalism. It's one thing to, you know, treasure history and traditions and so on, but some aspects of nationalism, whether it's English nationalism or Scottish nationalism, are deeply unattractive. And I feel it's an argument well worth fighting for, to try and keep us together. That's my plea anyway. But as I say, I speak as a borderer and as someone who dreads the idea of an international border just up the road. Brexit's bad enough. This could be make Brexit look like a walk in the park.
Great, thank you. David, come to you, please.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure whether I can answer much of this about Wales. Well, what I can do is this one of identity, and I've been looking in the chat. The idea of a combined authority is of authorities cooperating together, but they don't lose their identity. And I know that was something that was a big problem back in, I think, is it 2004? I get the day wrong, when we had the regional referendum in the Northeast. People thought their counties would go into some sort of bigger authority. The whole thing of a combined authority, it's a different issue from better local authority funding, which of course we would all agree with. But I think it's desperately needed on issues such as transport. You know, there is a big plan for transport in the North East, which just can't be done because there isn't enough money, and instead you get prestige projects like HS2, which most people in the North don't want. So that's not really an answer to your question, Neil, but I think talking about some sort of regional governance is not getting rid of people's identity in their own areas.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And then last but not least at all, Alex, we'll come to you.
So Neil asked when they'd stop blaming teething troubles. I'm not going to give an optimistic, I'm afraid I'm giving a pessimistic view on this. I think that they'll stop blaming teething troubles and they'll move on to blaming COVID troubles and say that that's due to why we've got economic problems. And then after that, they'll say that so much time has elapsed since leaving the European Union. It's nothing to do with that. You know, why can't certain people move on? And I just don't think that Brexit is going to get to the blame unless we do our bit and change the narrative. I do think that we will join the European Union again one day because I think it makes logical sense. I think that younger people are much more in favour of that and have got much more of an internationalist outlook. We are geographically close, we're historically close, and I think that those paths move towards that. I always think it's difficult for those of us who are pro-European and on the left because we're worried about so many other things as well as Europe. We're worried about the NHS, we're worried about workers' rights, we're worried about climate change, whereas those people who, you know, were in UKIP and the Brexit Party and on the fringes of the Conservative Party, they were utterly obsessed with the need to leave the European Union. And I don't think we found our core group of people who are utterly obsessed with rejoining in the way that they were leaving. This is a decades-long programme, so we've got to keep on at it. And I genuinely think the first step on that is making sure we've got a Labour government, which is why getting behind Keir Starmer is so important. It doesn't necessarily mean that you join immediately. I don't think it does for a moment. What it does mean is that we get to set the agenda and the narrative again, because what's happening at the moment and what has happened for decades is that the Conservatives and the right-wing people around them set the agenda. You know, the Prime Minister stands up, and because he's the Prime Minister, what he says is news and is reported. He's at Prime Minister's Question Time. He's doing press conferences day in, day out. He does speeches, and we have to try and oppose, and we're constantly therefore dragged into talking about what they want to talk about rather than what rather than what we want to talk about. So winning is absolutely vital, and making sure we do that sooner rather than later, I think, is an excellent step on the way also to joining the European Union one day. And one final point is, I think we need a good word for it as well. And I've always been in favour of Brit in, because I think that makes it patriotic, it's short and catchy. They came up with a word that didn't exist, Brexit, and made it into a reality. Let's us come up with a good word and make it into a reality as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex and David and Jackie and Joyce. It's a great pleasure to see you all, and it's been fascinating to hear from you. So we will finish up there. We're slightly over time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. It's been really great to have you here, and thank you for your questions as well. This is our last webinar before the summer, so we'll be back on the 13th of September. We have a webinar then on trade and whether Labour should propose that we align in government our trade policy with European trade policy to make it easier for us to re-engage in the single market, customs union, and eventually the European Union in future. So do join us then. We're also at Party Conference. If you're going to be at Party Conference, we've got two events, one on the Sunday, one on the Monday, and details for those will go out over email. So fingers crossed that conference happens and the government don't mess the pandemic up even more than they are already between now and then. Partly for conference, mostly for public health reasons, of course. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody. Again, great to see you all. Have a great summer, and I will very much look forward to re-engaging with you all come September. See you soon. Thank you again. Bye for now.
Bye.